The moment you hear this, I want you to understand one thing. Some truths were never meant for your ears. Secrets that could undo the very world you believe you know. In 1872, in a quiet town in rural America, one man, trusted, respected, revered, crossed the threshold of morality in a way that would stain the generations that followed. Jeremiah Caldwell, the mayor, had debts, not small debts, debts that clawed at his dignity, his power, and his freedom. But what he chose to sacrifice to repay them was not money, not property, not some distant promise. He sold his own daughter. Her name was Lydia, only 16. A girl whose laughter should have echoed in the meadows of her family estate, whose future should have been hers to command. Instead, she became currency in a transaction more chilling than any courtroom drama could contain. Caldwell orchestrated it with meticulous precision. Contracts, witnesses, a public facade of legitimacy. To the townspeople, it was a marriage like any other, a union of families. But beneath the surface, it was a sale. Lydia was not a bride. She was collateral. What followed was a sequence of horrors the town was never meant to witness. Those closest to the mayor began to vanish. Loyal servants disappeared overnight, some found weeks later, mutilated or broken beyond recognition. Strange fires consumed barns and warehouses, their origins suspicious yet never traced. The town council whispered about curses and ill omens, but fear silenced truth. Caldwell's power was absolute. Suspicion could not survive in his shadow. Even more disturbing, the girl himself began to vanish from public view. Reports claimed she was ill, that she had been sent away to live with distant relatives. But rumor whispered of hidden rooms locked away in the mayor's sprawling estate. Rooms where children were kept under surveillance, their spirits monitored, their identities rewritten. Lydia's disappearance was not an isolated act. It was the first stroke in a series of calculated maneuvers designed to manipulate, control, and dominate an entire town through fear and secrecy. By the end of that year, Caldwell had transformed his image. Where once the townspeople might have doubted him, they now revered him. Fear and awe replaced scrutiny, and in that silence, the seeds of a generational curse were planted. One that would ensure the town remembered this betrayal not as a crime, but as a lesson. Power could be bought, and innocence could be sold. This is where our story begins. Not with Lydia, not with Caldwell, but with the quiet, corrosive corruption of a society that allowed a man to treat his own child as currency. And if you think you understand morality, pay close attention. The deeper we go, the more you will realize that the rules you live by are built on layers of deceit, oppression, and manipulation carefully hidden in plain sight. The town remembered Caldwell as a man of charm, of influence, of authority, but that memory was a carefully curated lie. Beneath the polished exterior, he was a strategist of human suffering, a predator whose understanding of fear was as precise as any mathematician's calculations. Every glance, every whispered conversation, every glance of judgment from the council was monitored, catalogued, and exploited. He had learned early that control was never in the threat of punishment alone. It was in shaping perception, bending reality, and rewriting the narrative of those who could challenge him. The marriage of Lydia was not merely a transaction, it was a statement, a declaration that no one, not even the innocent, could move freely without Caldwell's sanction. Townsfolk who had known her as a girl, who had cheered her at local fairs, who had whispered about her laughter in passing, began to vanish from public life. Some fled quietly, sensing danger they could not name. Others, less fortunate, became pawns in Caldwell's expanding web of influence. He created a system where fear fed itself. A missing child here, an unexplained illness there. A rumor whispered just loud enough to unsettle the uninitiated. But the most disturbing layer of this story is what Caldwell did to Lydia herself. Locked away in a mansion wing hidden from the eyes of the town, she was subjected to subtle, methodical conditioning. The intent was clear: reshape her identity, sever her ties to her past, and mold her into a symbol of obedience. Every day the walls themselves seemed to speak. Every corridor was a lesson in submission, every servant's glance a reminder that the world had become a cage. And Caldwell, the warden. It was here that the town unknowingly became complicit. Each whispered rumor, each glance of avoidance, each polite nod at the mayor's charm reinforced the illusion that everything was normal. Silence in this case was not neutrality, it was participation. And in that silence, generations were being conditioned to respect authority without question, to ignore cruelty disguised as civility, to accept injustice as inevitable. By the spring of 1873, Caldwell's empire of fear had grown invisible yet absolute. The town's streets seemed ordinary, its churches and markets bustling with life, but beneath this facade, a system of subtle tyranny had taken root. Caldwell had mastered the art of control not through overt violence alone, but through calculated psychological domination. He understood that people fear what they cannot see, and nothing was more terrifying than a man who could bend reality to his will. Every aspect of town life was touched by his influence. The local council, the law enforcement officers, even the clergy, all were co-opted through a mixture of bribery, intimidation, and social pressure. Children were taught to respect him as a patriarchal figure. Merchants who resisted found themselves subtly sabotaged. Caldwell's genius lay in his ability to make oppression invisible, his cruelty interwoven into the ordinary. Fear became habitual routine, and those who tried to speak out quickly learned that the cost of honesty could be far higher than the cost of silence. Meanwhile, Lydia had grown into a young woman shaped by isolation and daily indoctrination. The girl who had once dreamed of freedom now struggled to even imagine it. Her identity had been rewritten, her thoughts monitored, her emotions catalogued. Caldwell had created a living experiment, a human soul molded entirely by fear, obedience, and secrecy. And he was not satisfied with just her. He began to expand his influence to other children in the town, experimenting with discipline, reward, and psychological manipulation to train a generation to bend under authority without resistance. Yet even within this carefully orchestrated nightmare, the first whispers of rebellion emerged. A servant named Thomas, who had been quietly observing Caldwell's routines, began leaving small signs for others to see. A misplaced ledger, a letter left in a public place, a story told in coded language. Another, a teacher at the local school, began embedding lessons that encouraged critical thought in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. These sparks of awareness were tiny, but fire begins in the smallest embers. Caldwell, for all his cunning, underestimated human resilience. He had assumed that fear alone could erase curiosity, and that control over bodies would guarantee control over minds. But knowledge, even hidden, has a way of seeping through walls, of whispering into ears that refuse to be silenced. And somewhere deep within the town, someone was beginning to remember that morality, though buried, could not be entirely extinguished. By understanding the mechanisms of control, by observing how obedience was manufactured, these early rebels unknowingly became architects of Caldwell's eventual undoing. Every manipulation he imposed carried the seeds of resistance. And that is the lesson we must understand. The more absolute the power, the more fragile it becomes, because oppression always leaves traces, hidden, yet undeniable. And yet, even as Caldwell consolidated power, a subtle resistance began to form, not in open defiance, but in the quiet murmurings of the observant. One servant, one child, one neighbor who glimpsed the truth and remembered it. These fragments of awareness, tiny and isolated, were dangerous, because even the smallest crack in a carefully constructed illusion can grow into a rupture that topples the foundation of power. By the end of that year, the town had been remade. Fear was codified, silence had become law, and Lydia, a girl sold to pay debts, had become the instrument through which a man tested the limits of psychological control and discovered that with enough cunning, corruption could shape not just lives but entire societies. By mid-1873, the town itself had become a living reflection of Caldwell's corruption. What appeared to outsiders as a quaint, orderly community was, in reality, a labyrinth of fear and manipulation. Shops opened and closed according to his favor. Festivals and fairs were subtly curated to reinforce loyalty to his image. Even the most mundane events were infused with signals. Who spoke, who laughed, who remained silent. Each action, or inaction, was a note in Caldwell's invisible symphony of control, and yet no power is without consequence. Whispers began to surface. A missing horse here, a burned barn there, rumors of young women sent away under mysterious circumstances. Families felt a creeping unease, sensing a malevolent pattern they could neither name nor resist. The mayor's carefully cultivated reputation for charm and fairness served as a shield, but the town's collective subconscious began to register a truth too dangerous to voice openly. Fear and suspicion became inseparable, like twins, feeding one another in silence. The ripple effects touched every household. Marriages grew tense, neighbors eyed each other with unspoken questions, and children, keenly perceptive, absorbed a subtle but unmistakable lesson. Disobedience had consequences. Caldwell's influence had transformed morality into a currency, loyalty into a transaction, and innocence into a tool of leverage. Even those who felt righteous could find themselves subtly compromised, coerced into complicity through intimidation. Subtle threats or social isolation. Lydia, confined and conditioned, became both a symbol and a weapon in this system. Her presence reminded the town of Caldwell's absolute authority. To challenge him was to risk not just your position or property, but your very identity, your very sense of reality. The girl who had once been a daughter of laughter now existed as a cautionary tale, a demonstration of how far a man could bend a society to his will. But the first fractures began to appear in unexpected places. A local preacher, disturbed by subtle manipulations of scripture to justify Caldwell's actions, started recording sermons in secret, using allegory to inspire thought and reflection in the congregation. A widow whose son had been taken under suspicious circumstances began leaving anonymous warnings in public spaces, and young Thomas, the observant servant, continued to map Caldwell's movements, catalog his patterns, and leave coded messages for those he trusted. The mayor's control, seemingly absolute, was beginning to reveal its cracks, and this is crucial to understand. Tyranny, no matter how sophisticated, always leaves an imprint. Every action, every act of manipulation carries the potential to be turned back upon the oppressor. The town may have been silenced outwardly, but in private minds were stirring, eyes were opening, and a reckoning was beginning to take shape. One quiet act at a time. Caldwell's genius was not brute force, it was subtlety. He understood that fear alone could only achieve so much. To maintain true control, he needed obedience to feel voluntary, loyalty to appear chosen. Every interaction was a test, every smile a probe. The townspeople quickly learned that to displease him publicly was to risk scandal, exile or worse, but to defy him privately could result in punishment so meticulous, so invisible, that it would haunt the mind long after the body was safe. In response, resistance began to take shape, not as an overt rebellion, but as a network of silent observers, coded messages, and discreet alliances. Thomas the servant had become a linchpin in this underground system. He moved unnoticed, listening to conversations, noting details others ignored, leaving small signals for those courageous enough to act. Another ally emerged in the form of Rebecca, a young widow whose sharp mind had survived Caldwell's attempts at manipulation. She began mapping the mayor's routines, cataloging which officials were susceptible to influence and which might bend if shown proof of his transgressions. Caldwell, ever vigilant, sensed the stirrings of opposition before they became a threat. He tightened his psychological grip. Every unexpected absence, every hesitant glance, was met with calculated interventions. A sudden inspection of a household, a pointed question that seeded doubt, a public reprimand delivered with such precision, it left witnesses questioning not the mayor, but themselves. The city became a chessboard, with Caldwell anticipating every move, and resistance operating only in the shadows, aware that one misstep could bring ruin. Yet this tension only amplified the stakes and the drama. Lydia, once passive, began to observe with a mind sharpened by necessity. She noted patterns, recognized routines, and began to internalize the subtle art of manipulation herself, not for freedom, but survival. She became both prisoner and participant, learning the very methods her father used to dominate the town, storing them in memory for a time when they could be used against him. This is the critical point you must understand. Tyranny is a teacher, often cruel, but instructive. Those who survive under it, even in silence, acquire knowledge that the oppressor never intends to share. Every manipulation, every act of fear, every whisper of deception is a lesson in power. And in that knowledge lies a weapon, a tool capable of turning the very system Caldwell built against him. By now, the town was a powder keg. On the surface, obedience reigned. Beneath, minds were plotting, noticing, and resisting in ways Caldwell could not fully anticipate. And this is the turning point. The moment when the story ceases to be about what a single man can impose and becomes about what the human spirit can endure, adapt to, and ultimately weaponize. By the summer of 1873, the weight of Caldwell's tyranny began to ripple outward, infecting every corner of the town. Fear had metastasized into everyday life, subtle yet unrelenting. Farmers hesitated to sell goods at fair prices, merchants flinched at even the hint of disfavor, and children learned to walk quietly to avoid drawing attention. Every household had its own story of loss or betrayal, yet most were too afraid or too numb to speak. The invisible chains Caldwell had woven were tighter than any physical restraint. The effects on the young were the most tragic. Children, once filled with laughter and mischief, began to display signs of psychological conditioning. A simple question, a misstep, a moment of curiosity could trigger punishment so precise and insidious it left scars invisible to the eye. Lydia, now approaching 17, became both witness and victim. She watched other girls disappear into the mayor's domain, re-emerge, changed, silent, obedient. The terror in their eyes mirrored the internal horror she herself had begun to feel, the creeping realization that life under Caldwell's thumb was not just survival, but a gradual erasure of self. Even the adults were not immune. Farmers, merchants, and townspeople alike found themselves trapped in an unspoken hierarchy, one that rewarded complicity and punished discernment. Obedience became currency, silence became virtue, and the very morality of the community warped into a reflection of Caldwell's own moral decay. Families fractured quietly, alliances shifted subtly, and trust dissolved like salt in water. Those who tried to resist found doors closed, opportunities vanished, and whispers met with feigned ignorance or deliberate obstruction. Yet resistance, though fragile, persisted in hidden corners. Thomas continued leaving coded warnings. Rebecca secretly gathered accounts of Caldwell's abuses, preserving the testimonies of those too terrified to speak openly. Even Lydia, now acutely aware of her father's psychological architecture, began cataloging his routines, watching for vulnerabilities. She was learning not just survival, but strategy, a dangerous skill for a girl who had been bought and confined, and this is where the story deepens. Caldwell's power, immense as it seemed, relied on assumptions. He believed fear alone could maintain order. He assumed silence equaled consent. But human awareness is a stubborn force. It leaks through cracks, travels along unseen currents, and gathers momentum in ways tyrants rarely anticipate. The town may have bowed outwardly, but inwardly, seeds of rebellion were taking root. Quiet, careful, and deadly to those who thought they had total control. By now, the stage was set for confrontation. What Caldwell had created was no longer a town. It was a psychological battlefield where each thought, each glance, each interaction carried risk and meaning. And in this tension, the first true tests of loyalty, courage, and cunning would begin to reveal themselves. By autumn of 1873, the town was a web of silent tension. Caldwell's grip, though formidable, was beginning to encounter resistance in forms too subtle for him to crush immediately. A misfiled ledger, a whispered conversation in the marketplace, an unobserved glance. All tiny acts, almost imperceptible yet significant. They were threads tugging at the tapestry of his carefully constructed order. And Caldwell, ever vigilant, felt the tug. He could not see the threads, but he sensed their presence, an invisible tremor under the polished surface of obedience. Thomas, the servant, had grown bolder. He began leaving messages hidden in innocuous objects: a folded cloth in a cupboard, a coin beneath a floorboard, a piece of bread with a letter baked inside. Each symbol, each token, was designed to alert a select few that they were not alone, that awareness existed even under the mayor's oppressive gaze. These were acts of rebellion, small enough to escape immediate detection, but potent enough to plant doubt in the minds of those willing to notice. Caldwell's reaction was subtle, yet revealing. He increased surveillance under the guise of concern for the town's well-being, inspecting households, questioning townspeople under friendly pretexts, and recalibrating his network of influence with a surgeon's precision. Every anomaly, every hesitation was catalogued. Paranoia began to seep into his actions. Where he had once acted with unchallenged authority, he now planned contingencies, doubled emissaries, and tested loyalties with pointed questions designed to uncover the faintest trace of disloyalty. Lydia, still confined but increasingly observant, recognized this shift. Her father's confidence had cracks, small, nearly invisible cracks, but cracks nonetheless. She noted which of the mayor's agents hesitated when delivering instructions, which servants looked at him with something other than fear, and which townspeople exchanged subtle signals of solidarity. These observations became a mental map of potential allies, potential weaknesses and potential avenues of escape, not only for herself, but for those who had been silenced by Caldwell's tyranny. And this is where the true power of control becomes apparent. Absolute fear can only dominate those who accept it. Once awareness creeps in, even the smallest spark can ignite rebellion. Caldwell believed he had engineered a system so complete that resistance was impossible. He had underestimated the human mind's capacity to perceive patterns, to question authority, and to strategize in secrecy. Every subtle act of defiance, every coded message, was a dagger aimed at the foundation of his control, hidden, quiet, but deadly. By now, the town existed in dual realities, one for the mayor, polished and orderly, and one for the observant few, filled with fear, calculation, and the quiet thrill of rebellion. And it was in this tension, this precarious balance between terror and hope, that the seeds of Caldwell's eventual undoing were quietly, irrevocably sown. By winter of 1873, Caldwell's empire of fear began to show its deadlier consequences. The lines between obedience, survival, and exploitation blurred completely. Families who had resisted subtle pressures now found themselves directly threatened. Men disappeared after challenging the mayor's directives. Women, even in casual defiance, were publicly shamed or quietly removed from the community. Caldwell understood fully that power is reinforced not by mercy, but by demonstrating the cost of resistance, and he exacted that cost ruthlessly. Lydia's world had grown darker still. Confined in her father's mansion, she became an instrument of control and intimidation, forced into tasks designed to normalize cruelty. She was sent to deliver veiled warnings, to spy on neighbors, and to observe the town for signs of dissent. Each errand was a psychological trap: perform them correctly or face punishment. Resist and bring ruin to herself and others. Caldwell had perfected the art of using fear as both shield and weapon, turning even his daughter into a tool to consolidate obedience. Yet, the very people Caldwell sought to terrify were beginning to respond, not openly, but strategically. Thomas continued leaving coded messages. A school teacher hid notes in books. A young merchant deliberately misrecorded inventory to undermine the mayor's economic dominance. These small acts seemed trivial, but Caldwell's system depended on precision. Each disruption, no matter how minor, created ripple effects that he could not immediately control. At the same time, Caldwell's paranoia was intensifying. He began isolating those he suspected, monitoring conversations more closely, and testing loyalties through cruel, psychological games. People could be punished for their imagined intentions rather than their actions. Fear became preemptive, a tool to keep the town obedient before they even thought of defiance. And through it all, Lydia watched, absorbing the mechanics of manipulation like a student studying a dark art. But herein lies the paradox of absolute power. The more one seeks to dominate, the more one inadvertently educates potential enemies. Every cruel act Caldwell executed, every test of obedience he imposed, was a lesson to those under his control. Those who survived mentally adapted, noting vulnerabilities, recognizing patterns, and learning the art of survival in a system designed to break them. By now, the town teetered on the edge of chaos. Fear reigned in the open and awareness blossomed in the shadows. And Lydia, the girl sold into this nightmare, was quietly becoming more than a victim. She was becoming an observer, a strategist, and a living record of Caldwell's tyranny, a record that one day could ignite a reckoning the mayor had not anticipated. By early 1874, the tension in the town had reached a dangerous equilibrium. Fear still ruled the streets, but beneath that veneer of obedience, subtle acts of defiance were beginning to take shape. The town had become a chessboard, and for the first time, Caldwell faced opponents who were learning the rules of his game while remaining invisible. Small sabotages, misfiled documents, delayed shipments, misdirected messages began to disrupt the rhythm of his control. Nothing spectacular, nothing overt, yet enough to unsettle even a man as meticulous as Caldwell. Thomas, the servant, had become a central figure in this clandestine resistance. Every week, he left a carefully encoded note in the town square, invisible to all but a select few who had learned to recognize the symbols. Each message contained information about Caldwell's routines, weaknesses, or upcoming manipulations. A letter hidden in a ledger might reveal a public event designed to intimidate the townspeople, giving those who received it a window to act or to prepare. The resistance operated like clockwork, silent and invisible, yet precise. Lydia, too, had begun to participate in these acts, albeit cautiously. She carried messages, misdirected servants, and subtly altered schedules, all under the guise of obedience. Each small action was a double-edged sword, a tool to undermine Caldwell and a means to survive. She was learning the anatomy of manipulation firsthand, the way fear is engineered, how authority is internalized, and how people can be made to believe in their own subjugation. The girl who had once been sold to settle debts was now becoming a strategist in her own right, weaponizing the very knowledge Caldwell had used to imprison her. Caldwell, meanwhile, began noticing discrepancies, though he could not immediately locate their source. Shipments delayed without explanation, records altered subtly, minor conflicts that seemed to resolve themselves without his intervention. Paranoia grew. He increased surveillance, interrogated servants, and conducted public displays of authority designed to reassert dominance. Yet each intervention played into the resistance's hands, teaching them more about his reactions, his vulnerabilities, and the subtle cracks in his control. This is where the psychological dimension becomes critical. Caldwell had built a world where obedience seemed natural, where fear was internalized. But human awareness cannot be fully suppressed. The very mechanisms designed to maintain control, routine, surveillance, manipulation, provided the observant with the information needed to undermine it. And in this delicate balance, the stage was set for the first confrontation, small yet profound, between a tyrant and the invisible forces preparing to dismantle his empire. By spring of 1874, Caldwell's once impenetrable control began to show its first visible fractures. The town still appeared orderly to an outsider, but beneath the surface, invisible currents of defiance had gathered strength. Small disruptions, missed deliveries, deliberately misfiled records, whispered warnings, had become frequent enough to unsettle the mayor. He no longer walked with complete confidence. Each encounter with a servant or townsman carried a subtle anxiety, a shadow of doubt. For the first time, his authority was being tested by forces he could not fully see. The resistance, though still fragmented, had grown more sophisticated. Thomas had developed a network of observation points throughout the town, tracking Caldwell's movements, recording interactions, and noting which officials were loyal and which were hesitant. Rebecca, the widow, had begun hosting secret gatherings where trusted townspeople could exchange information safely. Their goal was not yet open revolt, They knew such a thing would be suicide, but careful, calculated disruption. Every delay, every minor sabotage, every whispered warning was designed to chip away at the illusion of absolute power. Lydia, now fully aware of the mechanics of control, became central to this underground movement. She delivered messages under the guise of obedience, subtly altered schedules to create confusion, and observed patterns in her father's behavior. Each observation was a lesson in manipulation, a blueprint for how to dismantle a man who believed himself untouchable. She had begun to understand a principle Caldwell would never admit aloud. Absolute control is an illusion, maintained only so long as those under it accept it silently. And once the silence cracks, the entire structure becomes vulnerable. Caldwell, sensing the mounting threat, escalated his own measures. He instituted more inspections, demanded daily reports from all households, and punished even the slightest hesitation with veiled threats. Fear, he believed, could still dominate, but this only exposed him further. Every action became predictable. Every overreaction left a trail. The observant could anticipate his next move, plan around it, and exploit his rigidity. In trying to tighten his grip, Caldwell was revealing the very weaknesses that would undo him. And this is the truth about power that few understand. It is strongest when unquestioned, but it is always fragile when observed. Every act of rebellion, every small disruption, every whisper of awareness, no matter how minor, was a dagger aimed at Caldwell's empire. And the first real strike, subtle but irreversible, was about to take place, leaving him scrambling to maintain the illusion of control he had spent years perfecting. By mid-1874, the undercurrent of defiance had begun to coalesce into deliberate, coordinated action. The town's invisible network of resistance, once a scattering of small acts, was now moving with purpose. Thomas's coded messages connected observers. Rebecca's clandestine gatherings built strategy, and Lydia, keen, calculating, and observant, had become the linchpin of intelligence, quietly guiding the resistance from within Caldwell's own walls. Their first major action was subtle, yet devastating. A shipment of critical supplies, meant to assert Caldwell's economic dominance over neighboring towns, was rerouted. Officials who had once blindly obeyed now hesitated, misplacing records or delaying approvals. The mayor, who had always counted on obedience to enforce his authority, suddenly faced delays he could not explain. Every disruption, every moment of hesitation multiplied. Caldwell's carefully constructed facade of infallibility began to crack. Caldwell, however, was no fool. Paranoia had been building for months, sharpening his instincts. He sensed the unseen hand at work and tightened his grip even further. Interrogations became strategic traps. Servants were scrutinized with near-obsessive intensity, and public demonstrations of authority grew more severe. Yet, each overreaction revealed patterns the resistance could exploit. In trying to suppress dissent, he inadvertently taught them how to anticipate his responses, how to use his own fear against him. Lydia's role became increasingly pivotal. As the mayor's daughter, she had access no one else could claim. She observed meetings, recorded conversations, and noted inconsistencies in his story. Each piece of information was passed subtly to the network. She had learned the mechanics of fear, authority, and control, and was now weaponizing them in ways her father would never imagine. Every day she delivered messages, manipulated perceptions, and destabilized the illusion of absolute dominance, all under the guise of obedience. This is the crucial moment. Power, no matter how absolute it appears, is ultimately vulnerable to knowledge. Those who observe, who understand, who act with patience and precision, can dismantle the strongest systems from within. Caldwell's authority, built on fear and manipulation, was beginning to erode, not through rebellion in the streets, but through the silent, relentless intelligence of those he underestimated. By now, the tension in the town had become unbearable. Fear coexisted with quiet courage. Obedience masked strategy, and every subtle act of sabotage, every coded message, every hidden observation was a reminder. Tyranny, no matter how carefully engineered, cannot survive the careful, relentless scrutiny of those who refuse to surrender their minds. By late 1874, Caldwell's mind had become a battlefield. The very tactics he had perfected, surveillance, intimidation, and subtle psychological warfare, began to consume him. Every glance, every hesitation, every whisper in the streets was suspect. He no longer trusted his own counsel, his own officers, or even the servants he had once manipulated with ease. Fear, which had been his tool, had now become a mirror, reflecting back a constant anxiety he could not escape. This is the paradox of absolute control. The closer one sits to the center of power, the more isolated one becomes. Caldwell's brilliance, once his greatest weapon, had created an empire built on fragility. Every act of subtle sabotage by the resistance, misplaced documents, delayed communications, whispered warnings, was amplified in his mind, transforming minor inconveniences into crises. Sleep became shallow. Every shadow, every creaking floorboard became a potential threat. He was no longer a predator. He had become prey to his own paranoia. Lydia observed him closely, recognizing the cracks forming in his behavior. Her father's overreactions, his obsessive inspections, and his increasingly erratic punishments were evidence of the very vulnerability he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. Every small act of resistance, every coded message from Thomas or Rebecca was now magnified through his lens of fear, making him predictable and exploitable. She had become a strategist inside the heart of tyranny, learning to use his own tools against him. The townspeople, though outwardly obedient, began to sense the shift. They witnessed subtle errors, hesitations, and inconsistencies in Caldwell's orders. Fear remained, yes, but it was now tinged with uncertainty. Where authority had once been absolute, doubt now seeped in, and with doubt comes opportunity for those brave enough to act and for those wise enough to wait for the right moment. This is the lesson hidden in Caldwell's decline. Systems of control are only as strong as the perception of invulnerability. Once doubt enters the mind of the oppressor, the same mechanisms designed to maintain obedience become instruments of unraveling. Fear can sustain power temporarily, but awareness, patience, and subtle defiance plant the seeds of collapse. And in this moment, with Caldwell teetering on the edge of obsession and paranoia, the town, once silenced, was beginning to awaken. The stage was now set for the first decisive moves that would challenge Caldwell's empire directly, and the coming events would demonstrate that even the most meticulously orchestrated tyranny cannot withstand the relentless pressure of minds awakened to truth. By early 1875, the invisible resistance had grown bolder. Subtle acts of sabotage had become deliberate interventions designed to undermine Caldwell's authority and expose cracks in his meticulously maintained facade. A shipment of vital supplies was deliberately delayed. Townspeople began organizing behind closed doors, and coded messages carried warnings of Caldwell's planned intimidation tactics. Each action was small enough to avoid immediate retribution, yet cumulative enough to erode his sense of control. Caldwell, now consumed by paranoia, responded with increasing aggression. Public displays of authority became sharper, punishments harsher, and inspections more invasive. Yet with each overreach, he revealed patterns of behavior that the observant resistance could exploit. His predictability, once a strength in maintaining order, had become a vulnerability. Lydia, moving with precision under the guise of compliance, began to test these patterns, subtly influencing the mayor's decisions and planting seeds of confusion among his enforcers. The psychological tension in the town had reached a boiling point. Families lived in the shadow of fear, yet whispered communications carried courage. Children, taught to observe and report, became silent witnesses. Adults, forced into complicity for survival, began strategizing quietly. Every small act of rebellion, no matter how hidden, chipped away at the illusion of invulnerability Caldwell had constructed over years. Lydia's transformation was now undeniable. Once a passive victim of her father's manipulations, she had become an active participant in destabilizing his control. She had mastered the very strategies he used: surveillance, psychological probing, and subtle manipulation. Each act of obedience she performed was calculated, a dual-purpose tool for survival and sabotage. Her presence within his walls became both a shield and a weapon for the resistance. This is the critical truth. Absolute fear can maintain obedience for a time, but once those under its influence understand the mechanisms, they can wield them to their advantage. Caldwell's tyranny, built on intimidation and psychological control, was unraveling because he had underestimated the intelligence and resilience of those he sought to dominate. The first decisive confrontations were no longer a question of if, but when, and the stage was set for the resistance to exploit every crack in his empire, turning fear into strategy and oppression into opportunity. By mid-1875, Caldwell's paranoia had become a corrosive force within his own mind. The patterns he once relied on to maintain control now seemed to shift and twist beneath his gaze. Every delayed shipment, every whispered warning, every seemingly minor deviation from obedience felt like a direct assault on his authority. The very mechanisms he had used to dominate, surveillance, intimidation, manipulation, now tormented him, feeding his fear and distorting his perception of reality. He began to act recklessly, issuing contradictory orders, punishing the loyal and rewarding the hesitant. His enforcers grew confused, unable to predict which behaviors would invoke favor and which would provoke punishment. The town, once meticulously ordered, now vibrated with uncertainty. Fear was still present, but it was overlaid with tension, suspicion, and a growing sense that the mayor's absolute power was no longer untouchable. Every overreaction Caldwell made became a roadmap for those who opposed him, showing them precisely where control could be fractured. Lydia, now keenly observant, noted every slip. She had transformed from a passive instrument of fear into a strategist, subtly guiding the resistance while remaining outwardly compliant. She studied his movements, his tone, and the timing of his punishments, learning to anticipate his reactions. Each erratic decision he made provided new opportunities to subvert his control and protect those most vulnerable. She understood that power maintained through fear is strongest when it appears infallible. But as soon as cracks appear, every act of observation and patience becomes a weapon. The townspeople, sensing this shift, began to test boundaries. A merchant delivered incomplete records and feigned confusion. A teacher left lessons slightly altered to signal awareness to the observant. Thomas continued to spread coded messages, each more daring than the last. The psychological ecosystem Caldwell had built to maintain obedience was collapsing under its own weight, and the realization of his vulnerability began to take root among those who had once trembled in silence. This stage marks a turning point. Tyrants, who rely solely on fear, rarely recover when they lose the illusion of absolute control. Caldwell, in his panic, began to accelerate his strategies, attempting to reassert dominance through more visible and brutal demonstrations of power. Yet these very actions accelerated the erosion of his authority. Fear, once a tool, had become a double-edged sword. The cracks in Caldwell's empire were no longer subtle. They were visible, and those prepared to exploit them were watching, waiting, and calculating their next moves. By late 1875, the time for subtlety had passed. The resistance, now fully aware of Caldwell's patterns and vulnerabilities, prepared their first coordinated strike. A calculated risk designed not to overthrow him immediately, but to shatter the illusion of his invincibility. Each member knew the stakes. Exposure meant imprisonment, ruin, or worse. Yet the growing desperation and moral urgency outweighed fear. Silence was no longer an option. The maneuver was precise. Key shipments were redirected, ensuring Caldwell's economic leverage over neighboring towns faltered. Coded messages orchestrated the town's alignment, signaling who would act, who would observe, and who would protect the vulnerable. Lydia played a central role, delivering instructions under the guise of obedience, observing Caldwell's reactions, and providing immediate feedback to the network. Every move was synchronized, every action a strand in a web designed to entangle the mayor in his own schemes. Caldwell's response was immediate and telling. He issued abrupt orders, summoning his enforcers, inspecting homes, and publicly reprimanding those suspected of involvement. Yet his actions revealed more than they concealed. Each overreaction was predictable, allowing the resistance to anticipate and counter his moves. The mayor's confidence, once absolute, now wavered in plain sight. For the first time, the townspeople could sense that his authority was vulnerable, and even those who remained outwardly loyal began to question the invulnerability he projected. Lydia, moving with precision, exploited the chaos. She misdirected enforcers, concealed documents, and ensured that key evidence of Caldwell's misdeeds reached sympathetic eyes. The psychological impact was immediate. Caldwell began to doubt his own judgment, overcorrecting and creating more inconsistencies.
Fear, which had been his instrument, now turned inward,
tormenting him with the possibility that every action might backfire. And here lies the core truth of resistance against absolute control. Tyranny is most fragile when it believes itself untouchable. Caldwell had relied on obedience enforced through fear, yet the combination of observation, subtle defiance, and strategic coordination revealed that even the most meticulously engineered system could be destabilized. The first decisive act of rebellion was not a violent overthrow. It was a demonstration that control was neither absolute nor permanent. The town, once paralyzed by fear, now understood something critical. Caldwell could be challenged. And in that understanding, a new psychological power emerged among the oppressed, a power rooted in knowledge, strategy, and the courage to act in the shadows. By early 1876, Caldwell's control had become unsteady. The subtle sabotage and coordinated defiance had left him grasping at shadows. Every decision was weighed with suspicion, every conversation scrutinized for hidden meaning. The town no longer moved as one under his command. Uncertainty had taken root. Fear remained, but it was now infused with defiance. The once invisible currents of resistance were becoming a tidal wave, and Caldwell's empire, built on terror, began to show fractures that could no longer be hidden. Lydia's role had grown decisive. She moved like a phantom within the mayor's walls, observing, reporting, and subtly manipulating events to strengthen the resistance's advantage. Under the guise of obedience, she diverted attention, ensured that incriminating evidence was preserved, and coordinated the town's actions with an almost surgical precision. Each small act of defiance had cumulative power: one misfiled document, one delayed order, one whispered warning, converging into a force the mayor could not fully anticipate or control. Caldwell's reactions grew increasingly erratic. Public displays of authority became exaggerated and unpredictable. Punishments were meted out, not according to protocol, but according to impulse and paranoia. The once mighty enforcers, now unsure of their leaders' intentions, hesitated, creating more opportunities for subtle subversion. Each attempt to reassert dominance inadvertently amplified the resistance's knowledge of his patterns, weaknesses, and psychological vulnerabilities. The townspeople, emboldened by Lydia's guidance, began taking greater risks. Merchants delayed shipments strategically, servants miscommunicated instructions, and neighbors passed coded warnings to each other. Fear still existed, but it had been transformed. No longer a tool wielded solely by Caldwell, it became a weapon in the hands of those who understood its mechanisms. Awareness, patience, and calculated action had shifted the balance, and here lies the essential truth for anyone who studies power. Control is never absolute. The mechanisms of tyranny, no matter how sophisticated, are also lessons. Lessons that can be learned, exploited, and turned against the oppressor. Caldwell's obsession with fear, precision, and obedience had trained the very minds now orchestrating his undoing. In the shadows of his empire, the oppressed were no longer merely surviving. They were learning, strategizing, and reclaiming the power that had been stolen from them. Now, if you feel the gravity of what you're learning, comment the phrase "Shadows Unleashed" twice below. Acknowledge that you are seeing beyond fear and stepping into awareness. This simple act will lock in the first stage of transformation, not just for the mind, but for the way you perceive control itself. By mid-1876, Caldwell's world was unraveling faster than he could process. The subtle sabotage had escalated into systemic disruption, and the carefully maintained illusion of absolute power was shattered. Shipments failed, records disappeared, and enforcers no longer obeyed with certainty. His paranoia had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Every overreaction, every arbitrary punishment, every impulsive display of dominance revealed him as flawed, fallible, and predictable. The town no longer trembled. They observed, they calculated, and they waited. Lydia, now fully aware of her father's vulnerabilities, orchestrated the next phase of the resistance. With precision, she guided Thomas and Rebecca to exploit the cracks Caldwell had inadvertently exposed. Misdirected instructions created confusion in his administration. Public events once orchestrated to reinforce fear now became controlled opportunities for resistance to test boundaries. Every detail was manipulated to maximize psychological pressure while minimizing immediate risk. Caldwell's empire of terror was turning against him, and he did not yet realize that he was being played with the same subtlety he had once used to dominate. The mayor's mental state deteriorated rapidly. Sleep eluded him. Every whisper, every glance, every minor delay felt like an ambush. Trust was impossible. Even his closest enforcers, once instruments of fear, began to hesitate. Some outright resisted, knowing their actions could now be shielded by the careful orchestration of the resistance. Fear, the cornerstone of Caldwell's power, had inverted. It had become a tool the oppressed wielded against him, and here lies the deepest lesson of tyranny and power. The mind that cultivates fear to dominate others cannot insulate itself from fear's transformative effects. Caldwell's obsession with control had trained those around him to anticipate, manipulate, and counter his every move. Knowledge had become the ultimate weapon. The town, once a captive audience, had now become a calculated force, ready to reclaim autonomy not through brute force alone, but through strategy, patience, and understanding the psychology of oppression. The stage was set for the final act. Caldwell's illusions were crumbling, his empire destabilized, and the oppressed, once silent, were poised to act decisively. In the shadows, minds awakened, strategies refined, and the long years of observation and subtle resistance were about to coalesce into an irreversible shift of power. Tyranny, built over decades, was facing the consequence of underestimating those it sought to dominate. The reckoning was near, and every moment until its arrival carried the weight of inevitable transformation. By late 1876, Caldwell's reign had reached its final hour. The town, once silent under his suffocating grip, now moved with quiet coordination. Shipments vanished, public records were subtly altered, and the enforcers he once trusted hesitated, unsure of the consequences of obedience. Every system he had meticulously engineered to maintain dominance had been infiltrated, manipulated, and inverted. His paranoia, cultivated for years as a weapon, had become the instrument of his undoing. Lydia, central to the resistance's orchestration, moved like a shadow through the halls of the mayor's mansion. Every observation, every manipulation, every coded instruction she had delivered now converged into a single decisive moment. She had internalized the mechanics of fear and authority, turning them against the architect of her own suffering. The lessons Caldwell had imposed, the subtle tracking of loyalty, the conditioning of obedience, the weaponization of terror were now the tools by which he would be dismantled. Caldwell's collapse was not violent, at least not in the conventional sense. It was psychological, systemic, and total. He could no longer trust himself, his officers, or even his own perception of events. Public displays of dominance failed to inspire fear. Subtle manipulations of the town only revealed the cracks in his authority. The empire of terror he had built over decades disintegrated silently, like sand slipping through his fingers. Those he had once dominated quietly assumed control, not through brute force, but through the disciplined, patient application of knowledge, strategy, and awareness. The town, now awake to the truth, understood the profound lesson Caldwell's tyranny had imparted. Fear can enforce obedience, but only awareness can reclaim power. Knowledge, patience, and subtle coordination proved more formidable than brute intimidation. Lydia, once a victim, emerged as a strategist, a witness, and a living symbol of the mind's capacity to turn oppression into empowerment. Every whispered act of resistance, every observation, every carefully timed maneuver had built to this moment. A transformation not only of the town, but of those who had survived it. And here lies the final, inescapable truth for anyone who seeks to understand power and control. Tyranny can be absolute, but only until awareness awakens. Once the mind sees beyond fear, once it understands the mechanisms of manipulation, the empire of oppression becomes vulnerable. The lessons of Caldwell's reign are clear. Fear is a tool, not a fortress. Observation is a weapon. And knowledge, when applied with patience and courage, can dismantle even the most meticulously engineered tyranny. The town had survived. Caldwell's empire had fallen, and those who understood the darkness that had gripped them now possessed the knowledge and wisdom to ensure it would never rise again.